Okay, welcome, friends. Here we are in the harsh light of day, mid-afternoon. We're usually with one another at 8 p.m. Eastern time for our nightly community meeting. But I had an opportunity to speak with Jenn Budd today. I know many of you already know who she is because when I told our community I was going to be interviewing you, the comments just kind of blew up. Oh, Jenn's great. I can't wait. So let me give her a short but semi-proper introduction. So Jenn is a former U.S. Border Patrol agent from 1995 to 2001. She left because of some of the parade of horribles she saw and experienced on the inside of that agency. And I think this was before ICE technically was created in 2003, I believe. So this is kind of the precursor to ICE. Um, and she became something of a whistleblower, and she is talking about the horrors that went on inside that agency. She is an immigrant advocate, and if ever that work is at its zenith of importance in our nation, it is now. Being an immigrant advocate, our community members have heard me say 1,000 times, diversity is America's superpower. And as far as I'm concerned, it may be one of the few we have left these days. So, Jenn, thank you for jumping on with us. Thank you for the work you did as a public servant and the work you're doing as an immigrant advocate. And I'm thrilled to kind of get into it with you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm happy to be here with you, Glenn.
All right. I saw you on MS Now, my former home, a couple of days ago, explaining to the viewers in layman friendly terms. Okay, what legal authority do ICE agents actually have? Can they engage in traffic stops? Can they, this is going to sound stupid, ram vehicles for fun and profit? Can they run into somebody's home if they don't have a judicially issued warrant? I don't pretend to be an expert in this precise area of the law, immigration enforcement, but you were and you are. So can you kind of just talk about, as you were on MS Now, what is the lawful authority of ICE agents when they're out there involving themselves in immigration enforcement operations?
Okay, so when we talk about the immigration enforcement agencies, there's three main ones: ICE, CBP, which is customs, and then Border Patrol, which is in between the ports of entry. But right now we kind of call them all ICE. It's like how the immigrants call us all migra, which is short for inmigración. So we're kind of all lumped together because we're all on this same mass deportation thing. So when we say ICE, we're talking about these three agencies and quite honestly, anybody that is working with them. So the legal authority of these three agencies is immigration, customs, and narcotics that are coming across our borders and into the United States. ICE has a little bit of more authority in that they are tasked with going to arrest people who have been adjudicated as having committed a crime, and then they're supposed to take them once they serve their time and then bring them into immigration custody and see if that then makes them ineligible to stay within the country. So ICE is a little bit different. But essentially, they've kind of grouped all three of these together. They do not have the legal authority to stop you for a traffic violation, not whatsoever. However, I don't recommend not stopping for ICE because we've seen what happens when you don't stop for ICE. So whether or not the stop is legal or not is not for honestly a safe thing for you to decide if you're the one being stopped. It is for an attorney later on in the courts to decide. I will say that. I saw a stop this morning where the guy said, "Yeah, one of your taillights is a different color than the other taillight." And I'm like, that is not a legal stop.
Hmm.
It is not even a legal stop for a Border Patrol agent to stand on a checkpoint and somebody comes through whose DUI appears to be DUI, reeking, maybe even sitting there drinking beer. I've had that happen to me as an agent. And if you pull them over and stop them, then that stop does not count because you do not have that legal training and you do not have that legal authority. The problem that we have gotten into since 9/11 is that they've created these joint task force, and they call them Joint Terrorism Task Force, JTTFs. And what happens is the Congress has allowed them to assume the authority of the other agencies when they work together in these joint task force. So I, as a Border Patrol agent, if I happen to have a San Diego PD or San Diego sheriff with me, all of a sudden I can assume all of their powers as well. And so they're kind of playing this game where they're like, well, technically, we're all working on this mass deportation, so we can all assume each other's powers and this and that. But they do not have the power. And your local police departments, your state and local law enforcement do not have immigration authority to be stopping people based on suspicion of what they would call illegal immigration, undocumented immigration, which is essentially racial profiling. They do not have that legal authority, except that now the government has been doing these things called 287G programs where they give them like 4 to 8 hours of training and then go out there and let them all of a sudden become immigration officers. So what they've been doing, Glenn, is they're combining their authorities and assuming each other's authorities without any proper training, without any kind of consent from Congress and so forth. And as far as warrants are concerned, there's a 100-mile rule around any land or water border barrier in which the Border Patrol and CBP can enter your property without a warrant. The outside of your property, they can search within 25 miles of the border. It's even more. They can go onto your property and search your barns and things like that for people that maybe have crossed recently. They cannot do that in domiciles. They are supposed to have a warrant in order to go into people's domiciles. So this kind of and what we see in ICE and in this mass deportation is where they're taking administrative immigration subpoenas, which just means that a supervisor said, yeah, this person needs to be picked up and signed off on it. A supervisor. It's the lowest level of management, to be honest
It's
with
an
you.
they call it a warrant, an administrative warrant, as opposed to a
Yeah, it's not a
judicially
warrant.
right.
Yeah. Yeah, it basically should be like a memo
It's
to
like
the
a
guys
note
to go
from your
see.
mom. It's like a
Yeah.
permission slip, which doesn't generally have the force of law. But go ahead.
Yeah, but then they internally are like, "Okay, now you can break down doors to get this person who is here on an immigration violation, which is a civil violation. It is not a crime like murder or rape or anything. It is you have created an infraction. It is like a speeding ticket. It is like the, stop cams catch you or something like that. It does not hold the same weight. But they internally put out these memos and then they let the agents do it and then it has to work its way through the courts and it takes forever. So that's kind of the game they play. Whereas they're violating their authorities, they're going outside of their jurisdiction, and they're like, kinda like, "Well, what are you gonna do about it?" And part of the problem is that both sides of the aisle have not done very much about it in the last 10 years because it was mostly aimed at people down here on the border, mostly aimed at Black and brown migrants who were coming across illegally. And for the most part, that kinda satisfied, many Americans, not obviously all Americans. Um, and what we have been saying down here for many years is that this is going to come home. This is going to come to middle America. If they can do that down here, if the United States Constitution, the Fourth Amendment, the 14th Amendment to due process and all that does not exist for undocumented migrants, which is not true. It does exist
Hmm.
for them, but they're claiming that it doesn't. That's what they teach you in the academy is that they don't have constitutional rights like American citizens do, and that is not correct. But that is what they are teaching them. So if they've been getting away with that for many generations, then why not just bring it into Chicago? Why not just bring it into the middle of Ohio and so forth? And that's what they're doing. And they're just basically they know that Congress does not is not willing to stop it, unfortunately, and is not willing to. And honestly, at the same time, right now, Democrats don't have much power, to be honest with you. But when they did have power, they were not stopping it, and that was problematic as well. So.
So something you said I want to follow up on. You said that ICE typically involved itself, I guess, before these, out of control immigration enforcement operations in the age of Trump, with trying to take into custody and deport people who had been convicted of a crime and perhaps had served their sentence and they were being released from a
Mhm.
confinement facility, and ICE would go take them and then begin the process to see if they were subject to deportation based on the crime for which they were convicted. Was that kind of the lion's share of what ICE was doing before they tried to sort of expand things to where we are now on the deportation front?
I think ICE is a very interesting agency. It was established differently after 9/11 during the George W. Bush administration. It was actually not so in order for an agency to exist, Congress has to create it. They have to create the law that creates the agency, and then they limit the powers, and they say this is what you're gonna do. After 9/11, they created a border enforcement agency that included what ICE was doing, but then George W. Bush administration said, "We don't like this. We're gonna create this other thing called ICE." So ICE technically is not legal. ICE was created by the executive branch of government by George W. Bush to replace what Congress had authorized. So ICE doesn't actually have full congressional rights, but they originally started out, they created what's called NSEERS, NSEERS, which was the Muslim registry for men, I think I want to say ages 16 to probably up to middle-aged men, where they were forced to come in and say, "Yes, I'm here." And so they were doing things like that. They were doing things like jail checks. So they were supposed to go to the jails and see who's getting out when and keep on top of that to be able to get them into the immigration system to decide have they violated their immigration status and so forth. And then also ICE officers do things like when you have an attorney and you have to make your appearances every so many months or so many years to renew your stuff. They do that. They did that kind of stuff too to make sure you were doing what you were supposed to be doing. And then it became more and more of a harassment. So as ICE gets bigger and bigger, and we need to understand that ICE was heavily influenced by Border Patrol, and Border Patrol is the most poorly trained, the most corrupt, the most ruthless and brutal agency in the immigration agencies. That's why we see their management has taken over CBP with Chief Rodney Scott, is now commissioner of CBP, and also that we have replaced a lot of the regional directors of ICE. So you see that brutality that typically existed in between the ports of entry for those who were physically coming across in the middle of the night, trying to sneak through and get around Border Patrol and stuff, is now that attitude, that level of brutality and enforcement is now across all the immigration agencies, and that's the problem that we see.
Yeah, and you know whereof you speak when you talk about how Border Patrol is kind of, in many ways, it sounds like a rogue agency, a lawless agency, an abusive agency, both to its own employees sometimes,
It is.
and you suffered that fate when you were there, and to the immigrants that they are encountering.
And I will say too is like the Border Patrol has always been like that. All of our immigration laws are based in racism and were written by old politicians that believed in segregation and things like that. So that's kind of where these agencies are come from. But the Border Patrol has always, from day one, been corrupt. In 1924, shortly after it was brought online, within the first few years of the agency, they actually had to fire everybody because everybody was taking bribes and they were so corrupt. And so typically Border Patrol, you can have the least amount of education, you can barely read and write, and they'll give you a gun and a horse and a truck, and you can go on out there. I was unusual. I mean, quite honestly, I tell people, like, first of all, I got in before 9/11, but second of all, being that I was a woman, it just meant that the guy that was interviewing was attracted to me, honestly. That is the truth. It's not to say that I wasn't a good agent or didn't deserve to be there, but it's just that's the way the agency has always run. They have always run cover-up teams, illegal cover-up teams. No agent has ever been convicted of killing anybody on duty in 102 years, and that is just absolutely insane. And they have, for a long time, knowingly hired criminals, people under investigation for very serious crimes, people with ties to the cartel. and they get away with a lot. They get away with a lot because they're just considered, as far as Congress is concerned, they just consider them to be like, you're there to control, as they would say, the illegal immigrants, and so they just let them do whatever they want. And
When you talk about nobody being convicted for crimes they perpetrate against immigrants, I mean that kind of brings us to the Renee Goods and the Alex Prettys, and there are, I think, 8 total as of today who have been killed, and others who have been shot but not fatally wounded. What is Lorenzo Salgato Arojo? We've got Johann Sebastian Duran Guerrero. I'm probably not doing justice to his name. And then, there are people who have been shot and injured but survived. And when you look at incidents like Julio Sosa Celis, who is a guy who looks like had nothing to do with nothing, but you had some immigration officers chasing somebody else who ran into this gentleman's house. The gentleman ran into his own house and closed the door, and they shot through the door. Now,
right.
This old prosecutor who worked some police excessive force cases can tell you, you don't get to shoot people through the door. And then, of course, those agents ended up lying about the true circumstances. Shocking, I know. They said, well, the guy tried to beat us with a snow shovel. The problem is there was actually, I think, a city crime camera, surveillance camera that caught, and nothing like that had happened. And, it's interesting because when we saw the recent reporting that the feds have finally given over the evidence that the Hennepin County district attorney needs to pursue a full, fair investigation of, I believe, both Renee Good and Alex Pretty's homicides.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently, the feds wanted evidence that the state authorities had in the Julio Sosa Celis incident. And so it was basically like a hostage swap. We'll give you
Yeah.
yours if you give us ours. But I want to ask you about when you were with Border Patrol. Were there times when you had to work or wanted to work productively with local law enforcement? And in your experience, did that work well? Did it not work well? Because I can tell you, as a federal prosecutor for 30 years, I worked with the local state authorities, whether it was across jurisdictional lines up in Maryland for me, because I was in DC, across the river in Virginia. We worked with the locals productively and civilly and cordially and professionally all the time. And now we are experiencing just the opposite.
I would say during my time, so before 9/11, we call that the old patrol, and after 9/11, we call that the new patrol. So in the old patrol, Border Patrol agents and immigration officers in general were thought of as a joke. Not real law enforcement officers. Were just the immigration police. We didn't have as much authority and this and that. And they also were the ones that we were required by law, states so in our use of force manuals, states so today, that when we get into a use of force incident, we are required to call everybody with jurisdiction in that area. So that means if I'm in San Diego County, I got to call San Diego sheriffs. And I also have to call then the federal agencies involved that would investigate as well. Um, and then after 9/11, things changed. And the reason why things changed is even though it was the immigration agencies who failed to do the proper screening and allowed the terrorists to come in and commit 9/11 crimes, there was no accountability for anybody in the management, and they were given billions and billions of dollars. And what we have seen since 9/11 is that what DHS and the immigration agencies have done is they have bought off our police. Not all police departments, of course, but certainly the majority of ones down here on the southern border. And so on the southern border over the years, what I have seen in the studies, so the Renee Good shooting and Pretty shooting and all those look just like everyday Border Patrol shootings down here that I see all the time. The covering up the evidence, the attacking the witnesses to make them run away, the keeping evidence from the investigators. So what the Border Patrol did is they created these things called critical incident teams. And I want to say that if you want to understand these teams, HBO documentary right now called Critical Incident: Death at the Border. It just won an Emmy, and it's about my work. And it's about how the current commissioner of CBP managed to cover up crimes and murders from 2010 and is now somehow the head of CBP, and not even Democrats will talk about that, but you can understand that if you watch that film, Critical Incident: Death at the Border. So, what happened is they get this influx of money, and they start allowing these joint terrorism task force. And so what you see is the rhetoric, the anti-immigrant hate rhetoric, and the invader rhetoric and stuff, which did not exist in the patrol until after 9/11. Asylum seekers were just asylum seekers in my day. They weren't invaders. But then they changed that. Then they start giving them grants. And my latest book is an ebook called ICE: What Everyone Needs to Know. And it talks about this. There are so many grants that your state and local police can get, whether they're holding immigrants for ICE or whether they're getting training from ICE. They get money, they get resources, they get guns, they get trucks. And our police departments cannot work at the same level that they have been working at in the last 20 years without this funding. At the same time, a lot of their training has been given by these immigration agents, whether through their own private companies. Once they retire, they then create these private police training companies that then train them according to how DHS wants them to think of immigrants and immigration. And so it just keeps growing and getting bigger. And so the problem we have now is that a lot of our law enforcement is bought and owned by these agencies, and they are getting paid lots of money to bring in anybody who they consider to be an undocumented person or somebody who shouldn't be lawfully here. What we see in Minneapolis is those are police departments where the immigration agencies are not 100% on board or are assured that they're going to give them the type of investigation that they would want. So they don't trust Minneapolis police. They don't trust Chicago police because they don't have as big of inroads as they've had down here. You'll see the same shootings. So even though those shootings were going on, down here there's shootings going on where they have no problem with Texas DPS investigating. They have no problem with Cochise County, Arizona investigating. And they have no problem with that because their sheriffs and their bosses take a shit ton of money from these agencies, and they know that they own them. Unfortunately, like down here on the southern border, even though I saw today that there was an article saying that the FBI is now saying that they're not going to investigate any killings of migrants, that ICE can do it. ICE HSI does not have the authority to bring charges for human rights violations, so I'm not even sure what they're gonna do with the investigation if they're gonna investigate that, and they don't have the same kind of, forensics and ballistics and things like that. What they're gonna do is use these cover-up teams that have been rolled into CBP's Office of Professional Responsibility that now Rodney Scott is back in charge of, and he's gonna use those agents to do the evidence collection and all that. So they're gonna control the scenes. Um, and I don't part of me was like, "Oh, man, this isn't good." But then another part of me is like, "You know what, though? Like, I have cases after cases after cases that I've analyzed, and they're here on Substack on how Border Patrol and CBP do this, is that it's gotten so bad that even if the FBI investigators are involved, what happens down here is they notify the FBI, okay, there's an incident, an agent shot a migrant out in the middle of nowhere, and the FBI forensic analysis, the evidence collection teams will go, okay, well, send out your critical incident teams, which are illegal, and gather all the evidence, and I'll be there when I can get there. So they're allowing the teams to control the evidence. So even when the FBI is doing the quote unquote independent investigation, they're only using the evidence that is gathered by these teams. So the cases are compromised from the very get go. That's how it's done.
Bleak. It's a little bleak.
I'm sorry, it is bleak, but I'm glad that people want to know about this because I've been talking about
Right.
this for so many years. So
Well, we can't address and hopefully reform and repair what we don't know about. So
sure.
let me just follow up on one thing that made my blood pressure spike when you said it, even though I we know it to be true. Um, and that is that, law enforcement will sometimes intimidate the witnesses who were present when law enforcement agents engaged in excessive force. So kind of run the witnesses out, which is nothing but plain old obstruction of justice and witness tampering, quite frankly. But it made me think back to my days as a homicide prosecutor. We did just the opposite when we had witnesses without legal status. We would get them U visas, which allowed them to stay and participate in the investigative process as witnesses, appear before the grand jury without being, afraid that they're going to be swooped up and deported. We would let them stay here until the trial so they could comfortably testify without fear of retaliation. And then we would often, after they did the hard work of helping us
Mhm.
hold killers accountable, we would try to find them pathways to being able to remain here lawfully. And just, when I hear the kind of perversion of the work, that I know we did honorably, and have government agents run witnesses out only to cover up their own misconduct.
I
It's
tell you
mind blowing.
another thing they like to do is, and I'm kinda seeing this in some of the most recent shootings, especially with Lorenzo's, is they run to the press like we've seen. That's standard practice down here on the border when it comes to immigrants, being abused by, agents. Is one of the things that they really like to do, Glenn, and you'll love this, is, they like to take all the migrants or all the witnesses and put them in the same transport vehicle or put them into the same cell. And then by the time 5 years later, when it finally goes to court, they're like, "Well, we can't trust their testimony because they've talked to each other, and
They're
how do we know
commingled. You
that?"
can't commingle the witnesses.
But they do it on purpose, and they do it on purpose all the time. And then what I've seen recently in Lorenzo's case too is they're claiming now that they found small little packets of white powder, and they think it could be meth or fentanyl, but they're not sure. They do this over and over. In this case that I was talking about with the critical incident movie Death at the Border on HBO, they did the same thing. They said that the man that it was ICBP and Border Patrol killed this one man, and they said, "Oh, he, tested positive for meth." He didn't test positive for meth. He tested positive for amphetamines because they were trying to start his heart. That's what he wasn't on drugs. They were trying to start his heart. So, but they put that out and then everybody goes, "Ooh, he was on meth. He was crazy." So this is just, I mean, it's obnoxious. And I will tell you, as a former agent, when I realized what these teams were, because I realized in the field, I wrote about it in my first book about how I came upon these teams and realized what they were, because they're even secret in the Border Patrol. That's how secret they are. I was like, the thing is when you do get injured, because I have been hit and drugged by a car by a smuggler before on the I-8 checkpoint and stuff, people don't believe you. People don't believe us because y'all are lying all the time. So it's not to say that the job can't be dangerous, but the majority of people coming across, 98% of them, 99% of them are not criminals. And what I've seen over the years is, instead of accepting the fact that they are immigration agents and the majority of the people are not criminals, and they need to be adjudicated in whatever civil way and given, inspected and then given status and so forth. It's like the agents get so offended that people will not see them as heroes, as people who are out there supposedly stopping crime. But it's like, but it's not a crime to be an immigrant. It's not a crime to claim asylum. If you wanna go get criminals, then go join ATF or go join, but you can't because you have problems in your background. And so what they've done is they've criminalized the asylum seeker. They've criminalized the immigrants so that they can feel better about themselves. And that is what all of this is about.
And this doesn't even get us to the conversation about DACA that I thought we might have, because that, again, is a special kind of depravity that's going on. I mean, DACA with deferred action on childhood arrivals. These are children who were brought here and know no other home, no other country. And we were talking before we went live about how now they're trying to, basically criminalize them, deprive them of continuing to either enjoy the status they have or seek the status they're entitled to enjoy, just so they can put more heads in, private for-profit prison beds. And you know, I feel like we have so much that we have to tackle when the rule of law comes back into the light of day. Immigration enforcement is certainly one of those areas where, we've done so poorly for so long that I think it's
Yeah.
going to take heroic efforts. But when people say to me, because I say we have to hold all the criminals accountable who are committing crime, and I mean government actors who are committing crimes against the American people well beyond the immigration front. And people are like, well, it's just too much for our arms to get around. And I just say it's too much for our arms not to get around if we care about, running a civilized country and a civilized government, which we are just kind of dropping the ball on. And let me just add, I'm a rule of law guy, and I would never say nobody should be deported. In fact, when I convicted folk, primarily of murder, I was a homicide prosecutor for 22 of my 30 years, and they were undocumented. We would try them, convict them. The judge would sentence them. They'd go to prison. And then we put on them what's called a deportation detainer.
Yep.
So they weren't released after 10 or 15 or 30 years in prison. They weren't released back into the streets of the US. They were picked up by, immigration agents and officers, and they were deported.
Yeah.
And that's the way it ought to work, not criminalizing people who have been here for 30 years under DACA or other programs, and just to fill a quota that Stephen Miller has set. I mean, this is it's a special kind of insanity. Let me end with this, and I know we don't have a crystal ball, but as we head toward the midterms, and we saw Donald Trump's election lies palooza a couple of days ago, the speech he gave. How concerned are you that they might try to send, for example, ICE agents to the polls in blue states to try to interfere in and suppress the vote?
Well, I've been saying since the mass deportation started, I look at it from an operational standpoint. So I'm watching what they're doing, and the cities that they're choosing are cities that they're going to contest. They'll say, oh, they're blue cities and this and that, but there are areas where they're going to contest things. They're ratcheting up the violence right now. You saw the violence was high when Chief Bovino was running the show because he's flamboyant, likes to be on TV. They call him the Liberace of the Border Patrol, Chief Liberace.
With
And then
apologies to Liberace. Yeah, go ahead.
and then and then when he got in trouble and everybody got upset, they're like, okay, we'll back up. We won't be that bad. So wait a minute, you can just stop the violence anytime you want to because you're saying that the violence is like you can't control it, but what you see is they can control it, and it's because of their own actions and so forth. What I see is so what people need to understand is when they go into these cities, when they do these deportation raids, they're not just going into these cities and running around, they're creating infrastructure. And they're creating connections with local police, military, and they're setting up things to then come back to. And so what I anticipate, and I hope I'm wrong, I would love to come back here and say I'm wrong. What I anticipate and what I'm seeing is that wherever DHS Secretary Mullen decides they need to be to enforce election integrity, which ICE does not have the legal authority to do. Let's just be clear about that. Um, and Border Patrol and CBP do not either. Is that then they will go up to people who they look at racially profile. They're not going to be looking at me or you, Glenn. They're going to be looking at people of color, and they're going to walk up to them and say, "I don't think you have the right to vote." Snatch you up, and this is why they've been like during these whole 18 months, what they've been doing is when they do their immigration inspection, when they walk up to people, usually you go, are you a United States citizen? That's an immigration inspection, pretty much. Instead, they're not asking them. They're not asking for their IDs. They're grabbing them and taking them away. And that's unusual. That is a setup so that now on election day, they can walk up and go, yoink, and take you away. And they're going to take you miles and miles away, and they're going to destroy your phone and throw it out in the street like they do most people. And then you won't be able to call anybody. And you're going to have to figure out how to get back over there. And by the time you get back over there, the polls are closed. But it's to create a lot of fear.
Yeah.
And I know people said, well, he's already turned them on to Americans and attacked Americans. That is true. But they've been targeting Americans who have been doing ICE protests, and I'm not saying that's okay, but that's where they're targeting. This is going to morph. This is going to expand. into Americans for the sake of election integrity and things like that. So everything is a national security issue to them, and honestly, it just what they're creating is a national security issue. And they're making us less safe, and 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 we're going to pay for all this. We're going to pay for a lot of this of what we're doing. But yeah, I see the increased violence is leading into the election, and then with the election lies and this and that, and then Mullen coming out saying ICE is going to be enforcing this. I'm like, based off of what? Based
Which,
off
of
of what?
course, violates federal law. No
Yep.
troops to the polls, and that means military and civilian officers with guns. I am somewhat heartened by the fact that we've heard lots of blue state leadership, governors and attorneys general saying, and they've been saying for many months, we are preparing, and this sounds like a crazy dystopian sort of statement. We are preparing to safeguard our polls, our voters, our election machines, and our ballots against the federal government. And, I take them at their word. I think they are. I know there are a lot of great organizations that I think have probably already prepared applications for temporary restraining orders. All they need to do are fill in a couple of blanks in the days leading up to the election. And, we do know courts can act very quickly on election day. So, but it's going to be tough. It's going to be dangerous. It's going to be volatile. I still believe that we're going to have free and fair elections. They're going to be messy. They're going to be abuses for sure. But and then, assuming the Dems take control of the House and maybe even the Senate, the way I see it, and I am not a political expert, really all they're going to be able to accomplish in the next couple of years are running investigations into the, unchecked crime and corruption of the Trump administration, because they're not going to be able to get legislation passed, right? We're
Yeah.
not going to have a veto-proof majority. So the way I see it, let's get our investigations on. It was one of the things in the aftermath of what Trump did on January 6th, congressional investigations, the House Select Committee into January 6th was one of the only things that got DOJ off the dime to
Yeah.
begin to pursue the suits of the insurrection, the hierarchy of the insurrection. So, at least that's something. That ain't nothing if we can get those investigations up and running after the midterms. And then I'll tell you, Jen, come January 2029, if we don't go scorched earth after accountability for what Trump is doing to the people today, shame on us. We don't deserve to
Yeah.
keep our republic. But I hope we have finally learned our lesson. But listen, tell everybody, where can they find your great work? Where can they get your book? I know is it Border Talk? Is that your
Borderland Talk. Yeah, that's my
Borderland Talk?
Substack newsletter. And I also have Jenn Budd, JENNBUDD.net. You can get it there free as well. My podcast also from Substack, go to YouTube, Borderland Talk. My first book was Against the Wall, My Journey from Border Patrol Agent to Immigrant Rights Activist. And then my second book is ICE, What Everyone Needs to Know. And you can get those anywhere
Good.
online. So, yeah.
Jen, thank you for your voice in this fight and this madness, but we have to keep calling it out, exposing it, and then eventually when we can start to reform and repair. I mean, that's the mission that has called us as far as I see it. So thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right. Take care, everybody. I'll see you this evening.